Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our conversation about settlements. Today, we are talking about towns. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Here at Dungeon Brew, we are about to release our first large crowdfunding project on BackerKit. It is Thagum. It is a new campaign setting manual that gives you a grim, dark steampunk world. Over 200 plus pages. That's going to have new subclasses, new lineages, new weapons, gritty firearm mechanics, new feats, new monsters, city guides, and so much more. We are launching on September 9th, and we are looking for you just to go and follow the page right now and be ready for that launch. So follow the link, go check it out, and then come back to the video. Welcome back, everyone, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our conversation about settlements, and today we're going to be talking about towns. This is one step up from a village. John, why don't you start us off by talking about what a town is? How is it different than a village?
So I'm going to start out with how they're the same, which is that, and this is going to be true of everything we're talking about from this point forward, in that we start to get into more of a range when we're talking about populations, and we're talking about a range when it comes to availability of services, entertainment, all of those other things. So if you remember in our village video, we talked about how a village can be anywhere from about 100 to 1,000 people. And that's a very significant difference, 10 times the number of people from a very small village versus a very large village. When we're talking about a town, we're doing something similar. It's anywhere from about 1,000 to 5,000 people. And that's a pretty big range of people. It's a range when it comes to what is included in the town. And this is something that, as a creator, you're going to have to come in with what you want that town to be. Do you want it to be this small town that people are aware of and they pass through and it's known for a couple of things? Or is this a large town on its way to becoming a city that has all of these varieties of industry and shops and entertainment and all these other things? So those things being said, a town in general is going to have most types of services available in it, in terms of leatherworking, smithing. It's going to have most types of industry when it comes to things like mining or logging or fishing, depending on its location and the availability of these things. If you are in a smaller type settlement where there might be trees nearby, they may not actually have a logging industry because they can't support it. If you have a town and there is an available resource, they're going to be making use of it in one way, shape, or form because they have to in order to maintain what they've got going on. The same thing when it comes to agriculture or fishing. They rely on that in order to provide enough food for the massive number of citizens that exist here. Because again, keep in mind, we're kind of in this medieval mindset where you're not producing a ton of crops for the amount of available land like we do in our modern era. During this period of time, it's much more difficult to yield enough crops because of the type of technology that is available to them for producing those types of things, and in order to create enough food for the population.
Yeah.
So that's a very broad definition and a lot to say there, so I'll take a break.
No, it's a lot of compare and contrast. I
Right.
think it's important to consider when you're looking at developing these. And it's true that, and you and I have talked about this before, going back to the basic necessities and what's actually feasible to make your settlement believable when you're presenting it to your players. And that's a lot of what you're presenting right now.
Yeah.
And I think the nice thing as you're moving into towns that may even differ a little bit from villages is the amount of variability that you can kind of play with in creating these. For myself, I love the story, I love the mood, I love the theme, and so I look at the different elements that I have to include in that variability to give my players this presentation that's really reflective of the world.
Yeah.
Now, the examples I'm giving here are not medieval of sorts, but when I think about the Midwest and traveling across the prairie, 1700s, 1800s, what have you, the difference of going into Leavenworth versus Dodge City versus Wichita is at the forefront of coming into the city. You feel a different you have a different feeling, a different mood as you're stepping into each one of those settlements. And that's what you're aiming for when you're creating, I think, a town, is when you step into that settlement, there should be a feeling of disparity or excitement or law or justice or chaos. That mood is going to be really important in the creation of the settlement, where you're placing buildings at, how the people are interacting with you, all those types of things.
Yeah, that's very true. It's when it comes to this stage, you have something like a town is large enough to where it takes time to build that. It's not because you're talking about like the Midwest and building into the West during like the Western era. There were also things like those, pop-up towns that came along that were built around gold mining or something. The town would pop up overnight. All of these people would rush in, and then they were gone within a few months or a few years once they've depleted all of the resources there. That type of thing can exist, but even those never really get much beyond the size of a village, probably. Like, they never really get to a town status. Whereas something like a town, because you mentioned like Wichita and Dodge City, those were cattle industry. There was a lot of trade and other things going through them that developed them into something larger that was burgeoning and created something. More specifically, though, when we're talking about towns, to get to this size, they tend to have a history. They have a period of time that took growth and change and people coming and going and all of these other things that created a nice tapestry for you to work from in terms of developing what it is that this town is all about.
And I think that that's a great segue into talking about developing towns from the bottom up. Like, we actually start talking about the development of these. You're going to think about the demographics, the population. Who are these people? What is their history? Was it founded by 2 or 3 families? Is there, we talk about this a little bit with villages, but in towns, it's even more so to that point. These are your mayors, they're your leaders, they're your brigands. They're the people that are stepping in and really driving the town forward and moving it into a specific direction.
And the diversity increases in a place like this. There's we've talked about this several times. People are drawn to where wealth exists. A town, wealth starts to become prevalent. You're going to see more corruption. You're going to see a wider variety in terms of different cultures mixing in there, because people will travel to that place as a destination to ply their trades, to actually engage in mercantile trade, to either get money or bring supplies outwards into other areas. There's a big variety here in terms of what does this look like, and there should always be this kind of bustle about it if that town is doing well. And you talked about mood and theme. You can definitely play this up and go, why is this town so quiet? Why am I not seeing those things? And you start to get into, plots and quests and storylines based off of the expectation of going into a place like this.
Now, when you are creating towns, I think it's important to note that, much like a village, you're not going to detail every family,
right,
every person. You're going to be looking for key NPCs, key figures within it, key locations that are there that your adventurers might want to go and explore and see more about. I know that I may not develop fully every single location, but I will have an idea of what those locations are and what their layout is. So I know where the saloon is, or I know where the casino is, or I know where the bank is. I make sure that I have some idea of where those are. And sometimes the placement of those major institutions or facilities are important to that town's theme, to their mood.
Well, and speaking in the same line, you should have the factions that exist. So you could have political factions, religious factions, corruption type factions, which would be things like thieves guilds and other groups that are in competition with one another. But there should also be more neutral guilds like the Smiths Guild, the Merchants Guild, those types of things. This is very common, and I think that sometimes people think about a guild as being like purely for a corruptive purpose, but oftentimes guilds existed for the purpose of continuing a trade or setting up standards for a trade or ensuring that a trade was protected, almost in the same sense that we have what do I want? Unions nowadays. It is you pay dues into the guild. You're going to get apprentices that come and work with you. You're able to ensure that everybody is playing on the same, playing field in terms of what it is that they're charging for work and availability of supplies. There are benefits to guilds like that. And when it comes to the political influence that something like a guild has, that can be played up quite a bit, because if the smithy guild is, putting out armor and weapons and other stuff for the military because the military is getting ready to go on a campaign, they're going to have more political power in that town because they need to be kept happy so that they're able to meet quotas that the government is relying on them for.
And just to piggyback off of that a little bit, because I do want us to kind of swing into the type of government you want to choose, but it is important to recognize that once you get into a town level, you're now looking into people that might be more luxurious, or maybe looking at more materialistic items than you would be in other locations or other settlements. It may be the case that you have an artisans guild, you have woodworkers and glass blowers and basket weavers, you have people that are providing things that people are going to want into their homes to maybe keep up with a middle class or an upper class. And it's not going to be just for the sole sake of survival. Because you're right. When we think about these guilds, we're usually thinking about our blacksmiths that are building weapons and our armor smiths and our thieves guild and kind of these token fantasy concepts.
Right.
We're not thinking about all these other elements that are really important in terms of the functioning civilization that you're building.
Yeah, because if there's a need for something, there's somebody who's going to be providing it. This is not necessarily true when we were talking about things like hamlets and villages. They don't have the number of people necessary, and if you really want some kind of good, you have to wait for the merchant to come through. Like, you're not going to have somebody who's writing, or you're not going to have a bookbinder in a village, most likely, or especially in a hamlet. There's no need for it. But in a town, there probably is a bookbinder. There's probably somebody who does that trade, even if there's only one and it's a smaller town that we're talking about. When we get into a city, you start getting into more of that. There's bookbinders row where there's like 4 or 5 different ones that you could go and trade with. But here in a town, there's at least one of these things probably in existence, particularly when you approach that 5,000 person mark in a settlement this size.
And a really important piece, too, is, as you mentioned earlier, wealth becomes an issue here, too. So you might have a banker here where you're not going to have that in previous locations, where people can come and take loans. You have bank notes. You have people keeping their money in a particular area, because money becomes significant when you get into a settlement this size. People aren't just keeping their gold in a chest underneath their bed anymore.
Well, and in the same lines, the wealth disparities should be more obvious as well. So in the hamlet, we talked about this. Everyone is poor. You might have one person in the entire hamlet who has 2 silver pieces to rub together. Everybody else is relying on bartering, and it's a barter system. I give you some eggs, you give me some wheat, and we support one another based off of the industries that we provide to one another, because the whole of the community is important. The village, that starts to spread out a little bit more, and in the town it's spread out even greater. So you have very wealthy merchants who command a great deal of power and respect, and then you also have the poor quarter, where there are people who are tradesmen who are responsible for who just carrying goods from one location to another location across the town and get paid a couple of copper farthings for a day's work, and then they have to rely on that to feed their family. There should be a distinct difference when it comes to the amount of wealth that certain portions of the population have in a location like this. And since I mentioned diversity, oftentimes that is going to be in the lines of what preconceived notions people have about equality in this type of environment.
So we kind of glanced over governance a bit, and I'd like to swing the pendulum back towards that, because this is a point where you really are probably getting a top-down type of government. You're getting some real leaders in there, and they're in charge of those laws that order that wealth disparity even. They're looking at injustices. They're looking at corruption. And you can play this from a lawful good perspective or a lawful evil perspective. John, you want to talk a little bit about what governments might be you might want to consider outside of just the typical fantasy, here's your mayor that's ruling over the town?
I will talk about this a little bit, and the more that we talk about governments in these videos, the more that I think it's going to be beneficial for us to do a dedicated government video or a couple of videos on this, because there are so many different ways that you can express government, especially as you get into larger settlements and you get into a country as a whole, because we can talk about the government that exists in a place like this. And I mentioned things like guilds. So you definitely have that type of, maybe it's a mercantile power. Maybe the religious aspects of the town are in charge and they're the ones who issue laws. And you've got some kind of theonomy where laws are determined by a divine law. So there's a scripture that exists that says these are the moral laws that exist, and this is how we determine what is right, what is wrong in our society. But you could also have, like we had talked about before, a theocracy, and the theocracy is saying, well, these are the laws that we're putting out. It's not necessarily from a specific divine scripture, but it is based off of divine interpretations, which is a distinction that is important when you talk about that type of governance. So I think that the important thing is that in general, there is almost any type of government you can think of based upon who is in charge, who has the power. It could be a military autocracy where the military is in charge of a place like this. Like I said, it could be a theocracy or a theonomy, depending on whether or not religious officials are in charge. You could just have some kind of despotism where there's just a single autocrat who somehow seized power and is in control of this. You also get into a stage now, which is very interesting, where you don't necessarily have to have the government of the town tied to any larger power. We had talked a lot about how in hamlets and villages, they might be answering to something like a knight or some kind of lord who is in charge, which can still be true in a town. But you could also get into the city-state kind of situation where the town itself is its own entity that has its own governance that is separate from the larger whole of the surrounding areas, which I always find very, very fascinating to play with from not only a role-playing perspective, but also a building perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate you breaking that down, because it again just reinforces, if anything, the idea that you have a lot of variability once you get to this stage. So much more than what you have previously. And you're right, we're going to have to do an entire series on governments, because I imagine for many, again, you think of fantasy, and I think we all have this token idea of what that consists of.
The monarchy.
And you,
right? Yeah, kings and queens.
And you can do so much. There's so much variety in which you can add. I'm not as well versed in government, love looking at government pieces, but my mind, when I think of towns, really kind of slips into the religiosity, which you talked about.
Right.
At this level, there's usually two typical powers that are controlling a populace that is this size. One is the government, and the other one is the religion. And so at this point, you may have temples, you may have churches, you may have combined faith beliefs that are uniting the people, that are giving them a set of moral guidelines to follow underneath. And this is oftentimes intertwined with their celebrations, within their entertainment, within their festivals. These are the things that they do every Sunday. These are the things that they do in terms of celebration and holidays that kind of bring the people together, where they have this shared idea of their place in the world, what the divine looks like, what the arcane looks like. They have a long history that's been interwoven now. And many times that religious piece is what brings them together and allows them to function within a civilization that's this large.
And I think the interesting thing about this stage in terms of the size of the settlement is you mentioned, you have this combined belief that exists because of the shared beliefs they have from something like religion. Due to the diversity, you start to see a mixture there, right? You have certain groups that have certain beliefs because of the traditions that they have, because they grew up in this town and they grew up in this culture that exists here and maybe in the surrounding area. You also have groups that have moved into this town. They have relocated themselves from a different culture, brought their beliefs and their religion and all of their other information into a new location. And at that point, you're getting this mixture where it's like, you're celebrating the new year on this date, but for our calendar, it's on such and such date. Or we believe that if somebody does something that is wrong, then, you know, they should be physically punished for it. Whereas in this society, it's like the physical punishment is considered to be morally corrupt and you never do it. Like, you can really get creative with a dichotomy that exists between different cultures and different belief systems that allow you to explore options for your players in terms of moral quandaries, and the way that they view the world around them, and that also makes the world feel more real.
Yeah. And with religious pieces in general, if we look back at human history and understanding how all pantheons were kind of held up, it's also recognizing that the religion of maybe a medieval fantasy world doesn't reflect the same type of religious ideas we have in a modern world.
Right.
Many people believed in many gods, and they accepted that there were many gods, but they only had a patronage to a particular one, which brought these settlements together for patronage towards that god. But they didn't reject. It wasn't a black or white dichotomy.
Right.
Between places. It was this place worships Ishtar, and this place worships Anu. And we see this in many fantasy settings and in many books in the way that it's presented, but it's recognizing that as a DM, as you're creating these civilizations, you don't have to have this dichotomy of religion existing. You can have people within a settlement believe in different gods and get along because they still recognize all of these different deific
and even pay homage
entities
to different gods. They may believe in the entire pantheon, and it's like, I'm getting ready to go trade today in order to try and get food for my family. I'm going to give homage to the god of mercantile trade. And then the next day it's like, hey, I have to go plant my field. I'm going to go give gifts to the god of agriculture. They would give service to different gods based off of the tasks that they were undertaking for that time, whether it's that day or that season or whatever. It was very common to pay homage to different gods. And like you said, it wasn't the same way it is as it is today, because there's also this sense to, I believe in a specific deity, or I believe in a god, or I believe in some kind of existence of something, and everything else is false. That wasn't necessarily the case. My god was my god, or my pantheon of gods. They were the ones I paid homage to. Just because you come in with a different god doesn't mean that I don't think your god doesn't exist. I just don't pay homage to it. And I might think that my god is more powerful than your god. Or I think that my god has done good things for me, so I'm going to continue to give homage to that god, or to that pantheon of gods, and not to your gods, because I see that god as not being mine, being a heathen god, or some other thing. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I know we're getting close to the end of our time, and we still have a few more things we want to dive through. So, Jonathan, talk a little bit about military. At this point, I imagine we have likely a town guard that might be helping hold the peace. We might have a militia that's put together. You might have a training grounds by the time you're getting upwards towards 5,000 people, maybe. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are you looking at when you're looking at actual military within, or militia within this type of settlement?
I think that there are a lot of things to consider here, and this is a really variable option. It depends on your world, it depends on your realism level, it depends on the government that you're wanting to put in place. Similar to what we talked about in the village video, it depends on who's in charge, right? If you have an aristocracy, they might have their own personal guards, and their personal guards are all that exist in that town. They're not willing to fund a town guard to go around and protect peasants, because who cares? If you have a mercantile guard, or a mercantile power of some kind, they might be funding a personal guard, because they're interested in protecting their assets. If you have some kind of religious officials, a theocracy of some kind, you might have something again funded because they have tithing and they have money, they can afford to do this, or they have some kind of strict moral code, and so they're sending out officials that enforce that moral code in some way. The idea of a town guard is a very modern notion of projecting our own police forces into a medieval setting that didn't necessarily exist, really. This was really something that there wasn't a whole lot of in history.
I would say We don't need to talk about why the police force was formed, but it is not for great reasons.
Well, but I'm just saying that it didn't really, it's a modern concept, right? There's no reason why in your fantasy world there couldn't be a town guard, that there couldn't be some kind of law enforcement service that makes sure that things remain in good order or whatever it is. But generally speaking, it's an expense that whoever is in charge has to pay for. And that's not always something that people can afford to do. Most often, they levied peasants in order to fight for them when there was a need to fight. There wasn't really any other time that type of thing took place unless there was some kind of war or military conflict. So, in terms of military, consider that. You have standing military in the forms of things like knights and their personal bodyguards, and then lords and their personal, retinue that would be doing that type of thing, squires and whatnot. But generally speaking, there's not much of a military force or town guard that exists in most locations. If there is something like that exists, it has to come from someone's pocket, and you need to figure out why it exists and who is paying for it, because that is the person they're loyal to. They're not loyal to peace and justice and that type of thing in general. They're loyal to the merchant who's paying them, to the lord who's paying them, to whoever is giving them their livelihood.
And you're right, this has a lot to do with the construction of your world and how far advanced you are, and whether or not this particular town is underneath a larger city or metropolis or kingdom or governor. I mean, are there marshals that are traveling throughout the area to keep order and make sure that the king's laws are being followed? Do you have tax collectors that are collecting money in order to fund their pay and take care of them? Again, you have to make sure that your ducks are in a row, so to speak, to make sure that there is a rationale for why this is able to occur in the way that it does occur.
Yeah. And I think the last thing that I had on my list was just entertainment, and very briefly, in a location like this, we talked about things like shops and industries and things like that. Entertainment is the same way. There likely is a variety of these things. There are going to be entertainers that exist in taverns. There's going to be dedicated theaters. There's going to be street performers. Get creative at this stage of development in your settlements. It's a large enough settlement to support dedicated entertainers. All right. You're going to have people who have wealth, and they're going to be paying for entertainment at soirees that they have and that type of thing. The best singers and the best dancers and the best gymnasts and acrobats and things like that, they're going to be invited to these types of get-togethers where you're going to have an entertainment industry that does exist, so you can get creative with it at this stage, particularly when you get to that higher size of settlement, close to that 5,000 mark when it comes to a town.
And the last piece that I have on my list is just bringing it full circle back to the story, seeing how this functions within the world that you are developing. Many times towns are the primary centralized point for your adventurers to go adventuring, and it's the crux of the story of where most things are happening. They've gone through their hamlet, they've gone through some villages, and they've come to a town, which is kind of their centralized location where all their quests are coming in and they're going out, they're being involved in the politics and the primary arc of whatever your story is that's being told. Sometimes this does lead on to larger settlements, and they continue on in their adventure to seek out other places, but just recognizing how serious of a place is this town and how much time do you want your adventurers to be there, because many times adventurers get in a town for many, many levels. Yeah.
And they may never see any settlement larger than a town. That may be the biggest location that they ever actually come across, so keep that in mind.
All right. Thanks you guys so much for hanging out with us. Be sure to click the subscribe button, click the bell so you're notified when our next video comes out, and we'll see y'all next time.
Dungeon Brew.